Margaret Whitfield was 67 when she died in the reading chair that had been her refuge for 2 decades, her neck torn by the teeth of a creature she had loved as a grandson for 6 years. There were no screams echoing through the icy mountains, no time to comprehend the betrayal, just the wet sound of arteries rupturing in the absolute silence of a Montana winter morning, as 18 pounds of perfectly calibrated predator turned a routine of affection into a silent execution. For a woman who had dedicated the last 14 years of her widowhood to saving injured animals, dying at the claws of the emotional substitute for the grandson she never had seemed like an irony that even the darkest tales of the American pioneers could not have imagined. If Margaret had known that cold February morning would be her last coffee with Aspen, she might have chosen a less deadly companion. In a log cabin lost 40 kilometers from any neighbor in the northern Rocky Mountains of Montana, Margaret had created a makeshift sanctuary for the rejected creatures of the wild. The 2-bedroom house, heated only by a stone fireplace and surrounded by 20 acres of virgin forest, was home to injured foxes, blind owls, and even a badger that had lost a paw in an illegal trap. But sleeping every night in her own bed, eating at her dining table, and roaming the house with the freedom of a house cat was Aspen, a male bobcat who had become not only the center of her isolated world, but also the emotional replacement for the family that death had taken from her 20 years earlier. Margaret had found him in January 2018, when he was just a 6-week-old cub, starving and hypothermic, next to his mother's frozen body in a remote clearing. Poachers had killed the female for her golden pelt, leaving the baby to slowly die in the 30-degree cold that characterized mountain winters. If she had let nature take its cruel course that afternoon, he would still be alive. "Little angel," she whispered, wrapping the nearly lifeless cub in her wool coat. "Grandma will take care of you." The nearest veterinarian was in Great Falls, 125 miles away via mountain roads that became impassable during snowstorms. Dr. Harold Peterson, the region's wildlife expert, examined the cub with the professional skepticism of someone who had seen many unsuccessful rescues. Severe hypothermia, critical malnutrition, possibly pneumonia, he had diagnosed, observing the tiny, trembling body. 15% chance of survival, and even if it survives, Mrs. Whitfield, you understand that you will be raising a highly territorial predator? "I understand," Margaret had replied, stroking the cub's head with arthritic but infinitely gentle fingers. "But I can't let him die alone." How tragically wrong she was about her ability to control ancestral instincts. For the first 2 years, their life together was a modern fairy tale. Aspen lived in Margaret's cabin, sleeping initially in a box lined with blankets next to the fireplace, and gradually migrating to her own bed. Margaret fed him with a bottle every 3 hours, played with him in the deep snow, and sang lullabies whenever he cried during the cold nights. At 6 months, Aspen weighed 4 pounds. At 2 years old, he had surpassed 18 pounds. At 4, he weighed 30 pounds and displayed the disproportionately long legs and tufted ears characteristic of his species. At 6, when tragedy finally struck, he had become a magnificent 40-pound lynx, a solitary hunter perfectly adapted to survive the most brutal winters in North America. Margaret was proud of the unique relationship she had developed with Aspen. Every morning without fail, they shared a routine that had become sacred. Margaret would make her coffee while Aspen stretched out in his favorite armchair. Then she would sit down to read the local newspaper while stroking the golden fur of the lynx, who purred on her lap like a giant cat. But what Margaret interpreted as filial love was, in fact, an adult predator tolerating human presence for territorial convenience. Ranger Tom Morrison, the forest ranger responsible for the region for 15 years, had visited Margaret several times to discuss Aspen's situation. On every occasion, he left deeply concerned about what he witnessed. "Margaret, you need to understand that Aspen is not a domestic cat," he had warned during his last visit in December 2023. "Lynxes are solitary predators with enough strength to kill adult deer." "Aspen has known me since he was a baby," Margaret had replied, while the lynx watched the conversation from atop the refrigerator, his golden eyes fixed on the stranger with disturbing intensity. "He knows I'm his mother." Morrison had observed Aspen carefully during that visit, noting behavioral changes that Margaret seemed unable to recognize. The lynx had reached full sexual maturity and was showing increasing signs of territoriality. His movements were more assertive, his postures more dominant, and there was a pent-up energy in his muscles that any expert would recognize as potentially explosive. "Please consider transferring him to a professional sanctuary," Morrison had pleaded. "Adult male lynxes have instincts you can't control, especially during the winter." "Never," Margaret had replied with a vehemence that surprised even herself. Aspen would die of loneliness away from home. Unfortunately, it would be Margaret who died first. The winter of 2023-2024 was particularly brutal, even by mountain standards. The temperature remained below 25 degrees Celsius for weeks on end, and a series of snowstorms had completely cut Margaret's cabin off from the outside world. The access road had been impassable for 2 months, and even emergency supplies couldn't get through. It was exactly the kind of forced isolation that awakens primitive territorial instincts in wild predators. And Aspen was becoming increasingly restless. During January, Margaret began to notice subtle changes in Aspen's behavior that should have served as warning signs. The lynx had begun to mark his territory inside the house, scratching furniture with an intensity she had never seen before, urinating in specific corners to establish dominance, and even more worryingly, watching Margaret with a fixation that went beyond normal curiosity. There were minor incidents that should have set off alarm bells. One morning, Aspen had growled when Margaret tried to remove him from his favorite armchair. On another occasion, he had swiped at her when she interrupted his nap, leaving superficial but bloody scratches on her arm. "It's just the harsh winter," Margaret rationalized to herself. "He's bored from being indoors." But what was happening to Aspen was much more serious than boredom. Dr. Sarah Chen, a wildcat behavior expert at the University of Montana, would later analyze Aspen's behavioral changes based on Margaret's observations recorded in her personal journal. "Aspen was experiencing what we call territorial awakening," she would explain. "Adult male bobcats have a biological instinct to establish and defend territory, especially during stressful times such as forced confinement. During February, the tension in the cabin became almost palpable. Aspen had begun patrolling the house at night, walking from room to room with military regularity. Margaret often woke up to the sound of his claws clicking on the wooden floor, but she interpreted this behavior as normal restlessness. She was tragically mistaken. The morning of February 15, 2024, dawned with a temperature of 32 degrees Celsius, the lowest recorded that winter. Snow had accumulated up to the windows, creating a deathly silence that amplified every sound inside the cabin. Margaret woke up at 6:30 a.m., as she always did, looking forward to her morning routine of coffee and reading. It was a ritual she had maintained religiously for 6 years, ever since Aspen had grown old enough to join her in the living room. It was a ritual that would prove fatal. By 7 a.m., Margaret had prepared her coffee in the small kitchen, the familiar aroma filling the chilly cabin. Aspen was in his usual spot, stretched out on Margaret's reading chair, a brown leather armchair that had belonged to her late husband. "Good morning, my angel," Margaret said softly, carrying her steaming mug toward the living room, ready for our morning together. She should have noticed that Aspen was completely still, his muscles tense like coiled springs. Margaret approached the armchair as she had done thousands of times before, expecting Aspen to move to make room for her as he usually did. But that morning, the lynx remained exactly where he was, his golden eyes fixed on her with an intensity that should have set off all her survival alarms. "Come on, sweetheart," Margaret said gently, reaching out to stroke Aspen's head. "Let Grandma sit down." It was the last mistake she would ever make. What happened next lasted only seconds, but it represented the purest manifestation of predatory instinct the Rocky Mountains had witnessed in decades. Aspen exploded from the armchair with a speed that defied his reputation for feline laziness. His claws extended and jaws open. Margaret barely had time to register the movement before 18 pounds of perfectly calibrated predator collided with her. Aspen landed on her chest, knocking her back into the armchair, his claws digging deep into her shoulders as his jaws headed straight for her neck. It was the attack of a territorial predator defending its space against a perceived intruder. Margaret tried to scream, but the force of the impact had knocked all the air out of her lungs. She tried to push Aspen away, but her 67-year-old hands were no match for the musculature of a lynx in territorial rage. Aspen's teeth found Margaret's carotid artery with the precision of a surgeon. It was not a wild, uncontrolled attack. It was a calculated, lethal move, executed with the efficiency that had kept his species alive for millions of years. Margaret Whitfield was dying in the arms of the creature she had loved as a grandson. Blood spurted from the wound in Margaret's neck, staining the leather armchair and creating a growing pool on the wooden floor. Aspen held his grip for several minutes, even after Margaret's movements ceased completely. When he finally let go, Margaret had died from a combination of blood loss and traumatic shock. Aspen positioned himself over the body, licking the blood from his paws with the naturalness of a predator who had just made a successful hunt. Thus died Margaret Whitfield, not through malice, but because she was on the wrong side of a territorial awakening. For the next 3 days, Aspen remained in the cabin with Margaret's body, behaving exactly as a wild lynx would behave with a fallen prey. He fed partially on the body, marked his territory around the armchair, and stood guard against imaginary intruders. The discovery came when Jerry Walsh, the nearest neighbor 15 kilometers away, became concerned when he didn't see smoke coming from Margaret's chimney for several days in a row. He knew she depended solely on the fireplace for heat and would never let the fire go out completely in the extreme cold. What Walsh found when he broke the back window to enter the cabin would haunt him for the rest of his life. The living room looked like a scene from a horror movie. Margaret was in the armchair, her body partially consumed, while Aspen stood over her in a protective stance. The lynx growled menacingly when Walsh appeared, but did not attack immediately. Walsh quickly backed away, closing the door between himself and the grotesque scene, and called the authorities with trembling hands. "I need to report a death," he managed to say. "Margaret Whitfield. I think she was killed by her lynx." The dispatcher initially thought it was a prank call, until Walsh insisted on the veracity of his statement. The authorities' response was complicated by the extreme isolation of the cabin and the presence of Aspen. The Montana Wildlife Service dispatched a specialized team, but it took 6 hours to reach the cabin through snow-blocked roads. Warden Lisa Thompson, a senior officer specializing in big cats, had dealt with lynx attacks before, but never in a domestic setting. The situation presented unique challenges, both legal and practical. "We need to remove the body," she told the veterinary specialist accompanying the team, "but we can't go in while the lynx is in territorial mode." Dr. Michael Foster, a veterinarian with 20 years of experience with wild cats, studied Aspen through the window. The lynx showed all the signs of a predator that had established territorial dominance over the cabin. "We're going to need to use remote sedation," he explained, "but it's going to be dangerous. Territorial bobcats can be extremely aggressive when cornered." It took 5 hours to sedate Aspen and remove Margaret's body from the cabin. Margaret's autopsy, conducted by the Glacier County Medical Examiner, revealed injuries that were both precise and devastating. Dr. Robert Kim had examined victims of wildlife attacks before, but he had rarely seen anything so surgically lethal. "Death by exsanguination due to laceration of the carotid artery," he recorded in his official report. "Consistent with large feline attack, multiple defensive lacerations indicate brief struggle." The claw and tooth marks on Margaret showed Aspen's terrifying efficiency. Deep but controlled wounds, aimed specifically at vital areas. It was the attack pattern of an experienced predator, not a panicked domestic animal. Aspen had killed Margaret with the same efficiency he would have used for any territorial prey. With Margaret's death, Aspen was officially classified as an extremely dangerous animal by the state of Montana. Clear protocols dictated that any wild predator involved in a human death must be euthanized. The decision was carried out 24 hours after the body was removed, using an overdose of anesthetic administered by Dr. Foster. Aspen died peacefully, with no apparent understanding that he had killed the only person who had ever loved him. Dr. Foster, who had supervised the euthanasia, offered an explanation that would become the official version of events. "It was not an attack motivated by hunger or fear," he explained to investigators. "It was completely normal territorial behavior. Aspen had established the cabin as his territory and reacted aggressively when he perceived Margaret as a threat to that territory. It was exactly what bobcats do, defend their space with lethal force when necessary." Margaret's cabin was sealed off by authorities and later sold by her family. The new owners demolished it completely, building a modern home on the same site. The other rescued animals were transferred to licensed sanctuaries. Walsh, who had discovered the body, developed a severe phobia of felines that forced him to move to an urban area. He never fully recovered from the images he had witnessed. The tragedy had claimed more victims than just Margaret and Aspen. Wildcat behavior experts from across the country studied Margaret and Aspen's case, trying to understand how 6 years of seemingly harmonious coexistence had ended in fatal territoriality. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, an ethologist specializing in bobcats at the Wildlife Conservation Society, offered an analysis that has become widely accepted in the scientific community. The problem wasn't that Aspen became aggressive, she explained. The problem was that Margaret never understood that she was sharing territory with a predator, not raising a pet. According to Dr. Walsh, male bobcats have an irrepressible biological instinct to establish and defend territory, especially when they reach full sexual maturity. The forced isolation of winter combined with maturing hormones created a perfect storm. Aspen began to see the cabin as exclusively his territory, and Margaret as an intruder who needed to be eliminated. The lesson was devastatingly clear. Maternal love cannot rewrite millions of years of territorial instincts. Today, 3 years after Margaret Whitfield's death, her case has become required reading in wildlife management programs across Montana. Universities use her story to teach about the dangers of false domestication of native predators. Drastically stricter regulations were implemented for the private rescue of wild cats. The keeping of adult bobcats was completely banned for civilians, a law that became known as the Whitfield Law. Ranger Morrison, who had tried to warn Margaret about the growing dangers, became a leading advocate for these regulations. "Margaret had the purest heart I've ever known," he often says in his educational lectures. But a pure heart cannot alter basic biology. A lynx is a territorial predator, no matter how much love it receives. Her death was not in vain if it serves to save both human and animal lives. In the small cemetery in Great Falls, where Margaret was buried alongside her late husband, a granite plaque tells her story in simple words: "Mother of the Mountain Orphans." It is an accurate epitaph, but incomplete. Margaret did not die because she loved too much. She died because she confused behavioral conditioning with actual domestication, believing that maternal care could suppress ancestral territorial instincts. Aspen, in his 6 years of captivity, never ceased to be a wild bobcat. He simply tolerated human presence until hormonal maturity and environmental stress reactivated territorial programming that had never really disappeared. There was no villain in this tragedy, just a woman who loved beyond safety, and a predator who defended territory according to his unchanging nature. Margaret Whitfield's last caress still echoes today through the frozen valleys of Montana as a grim reminder. In nature, there are no adopted grandchildren, only temporarily tolerant predators waiting for the right moment to awaken. And love is not the same as security.